Right, guys. Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much for coming out and spending this time with us. This is part of a series of Lenten talks that we're doing, covering the church and liberalism, the church and Islam, the church and demographic collapse, and the need for unity within the church. The point of these talks is for edification and encouragement. We're going to be spending about 45 minutes me doing a talk, and then 45 minutes of us talking as a group. Today's talk is going to be talking about the church and liberalism. And we're going to be using history as our way into the topic, as a way of framing the conversation that comes later. So the first 45 minutes is going to be spent talking about history, and then the conversation, the next 45 minutes, is when we're all going to obviously be talking about the present day. I just want to say that everyone is welcome, whether you're a Christian or not. But the talks assume a Christian audience. Now, that's not to the detriment of anyone else, but that's the target group that we're going for. But if you're not a Christian, you're more than welcome, and your input later on is also very welcome. So, without further ado, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I just want to talk a little bit about how Christianity arrived here. Christianity arrived on these islands in the 2nd century. Because of the Pax Romana and the infiltration of the Christian faith into the Roman legions and amongst the Roman merchant class, Christianity became established in Roman settlements and Roman urban areas like Londinium, amongst other places, as part of the mosaic of Roman religious life. It started off as a minority, and it was also a persecuted minority, as the story of St. Alban will tell you, who was the first martyr, Christian martyr of these islands, after whom the name St. Albans, the city, is named, because that's where his shrine is. Christians eventually were taken in as an established part of religious life in Rome, in which it clearly then began to explode after the acceptance by St. Constantine and the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. And by the 4th century, we know that the Christian faith was well established in the Roman province. However, we're going to pick up our story a little bit later. We're going to pick it up with the fall of Rome. So when in the early mid to 4th century, the Emperor Honorius ordered the withdrawal of the legions from the province of Britannia, with the infamous words of "look to your own defense," the Roman Church, which was the church that the Romans had brought with them, and by that I don't mean the Roman Catholic Church, on these islands quickly collapsed. It collapsed along with Roman urbanization, which also collapsed. Saxon invasion and the resulting genocide of the indigenous population resulted in the peoples of these islands abandoning the major cities and retreating westward and southward as a combination of Angles, Jutes, Picts, Celts invaded the islands to claim it for themselves, including most notably Saxons. The church that the Romans brought dissolved into a Celtic church, and both the Celts and Christianity with the Celts was forced into retreat. It's in this milieu of time that the fable of King Arthur is set. Archaeological records show that great swathes of England note in the record that Christianity just seems to vanish. It disappears. There's the discontinuity of the Christian presence in the archaeological record. So, for instance, the abandonment of the church at Silchester, or the fact that pagan rituals replaced Christian burial rituals from around 410 onwards, as can be seen in Winchester, Langkill. Christianity did survive, of course. It survived in Wales, Cornwall and Devon, where the Celts had their stronghold and where they managed to hold out against this pagan Saxon onslaught. The historian John Morris argued, somewhat controversially, in line with the Arthurian legend, that Christianity formed the basis of an emerging Celtic resistance to the Saxon pagan invasion. However, the Celtic response that is remembered in history is the one that's preserved by the Church, and that is her missionary enterprise. Now, in the 4th century and 5th century, we see the emergence of two churches. There were missions launched by the newly emerging Roman Catholic Church that was developing a sense of itself after the collapse of Rome in 410 AD. And the Celtic Church that was already here, that was also developing in response to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But the Celtic Church was isolated to these islands, whereas the Roman Catholic Church was across the western continent of the formerly Roman Empire. Missionary efforts by those of St. Patrick, who evangelized the Celts of Ireland, that then gave birth to a missionary movement rooted in Celtic monasticism, gave birth to monasteries like Lindisfarne by St. Aidan, who evangelized the Saxon peoples, monasteries like Iona, that was founded by St. Columba, whilst he evangelized the Pict. These monasteries gave us many of our literary jewels, such as the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, and so on. Rome, independently of this church, launched its own missionary efforts. St. Augustine of Rome was sent to evangelize the angelic-looking Saxons, whose missionary effort led to the conversion of King Ethelbert of Kent. The islands were now split into various Saxon and Celtic domains. Canterbury became eventually the seat of the Roman Catholic Church in the islands, whilst Celtic Christianity was strongest in the northwest and Wales, Cornwall, in places like Northumbria. And these two churches, both of whom developed from the fall of the Western Roman Empire, began to develop different liturgical practices, but recognized one another as Christian brothers. Despite the differences over Easter, the way to do tonsure, and other matters of religious practice, they agreed to meet at the Council of Whitby in 664 AD and argued their respective positions in front of the king Oswiu, who, for astute political and religious reasons, submitted his kingdom to the Roman tradition. Celtic Christianity was eventually absorbed into the Roman tradition and disappeared just as the Celts were eclipsed by the more dominant Saxon culture. The church became an intrinsic part of the various Saxon kingdoms. The monasteries were not just centres of religious life, but also centres of learning, kingdom administration and culture, such as those found in Jarrow and Glastonbury. At this point, we can speak of an English Christianity, we can speak of a Saxon church, but we can't speak of a Church of England. And the reason for that is because at this point, England didn't exist. We move forward a little bit in time to sort of pick up the story at the point that leads to the birth of England as born by the Saxon Church. And that's a really important point that I hope that you'll all keep in mind. Because in a replay of history, a new pagan horde descended on these islands. Men from the north, Norsemen, latterly known as Vikings, began at first to raid and then to settle on the islands, smashing up the Saxon kingdoms as they went and forcing both Saxon culture and Saxon Christianity in retreat. From the 8th century, Christianity was forced backwards and eradicated as the Danelaw established itself across swathes of the northeast and southeast England. The church wasn't, though, without its champions, the greatest of which became King Alfred, latterly known as King Alfred the Great, whose war with the great heathen army culminated in his victory at the Battle of Edington in 87 AD. King Guthrum of the Danes was forced to accept baptism, Alfred the Great becoming his godfather as well as his overlord, and Danelaw was forced to tolerate Christianity as part of the Treaty of Wedmore. Alfred began a civilizational project as part of his reign, where he centered English culture and the idea of English nationhood around the church and monarchy. And he did so in defense of Christianity. Christianity became infused into every part of his kingdom. This was the foundation stone upon what was to become the Kingdom of England, an achievement won by his grandson Athelstan, who, after defeating the remainder of the Norsemen, then went on to defeat the Pict Norseman alliance at the Battle of Brunanburh and adopted the title Rex Angelorum, King of the English. It was here that the Saxon Church, therefore, had given birth to the Kingdom of England. And it's from 937 AD that we can finally speak officially of a Church of England, because there was actually an England for it to be Church of. Though we have to be clear that that Church of England was a Roman Catholic church. Now we've got to fast forward again in time to frame our conversation, to talk about the establishment of what we understand to be the Church of England today, the Church of England proper. The birth of the Church of England as we think of it today was the project of King Henry VIII, who the historian G.W. Bernard argued in his work, The King's Reformation, was not a radical reformer, but simply sought control over the church governance rather than doctrinal change motivated by personal reasons, that being the king's great matter, his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which he believed to be an invalid marriage because of Catherine's prior marriage to his brother Arthur, a conclusion that he came to due to his sense of trauma at having no male heirs despite having a female heir. Pope Clement VII refused to grant an annulment, and Henry, chucking his toys out of the pram with the help of Thomas Cromwell, used the Act of Supremacy in 1534 to create a novel church jurisdiction under the King of England. It wasn't until Thomas Cranmer, who became Archbishop in 1533, who was himself a true reformer, that the ideas of the Reformation that was ripping apart the continent of Europe began to be introduced into the Church of England during the regency of Edward VII. He drafted the 42 Articles in 1553, and this blended both Protestant and Catholic elements within the creation of a protesting, partially reformed Catholic Church that we call the Church of England today. Latterly, the Church understood itself as following a principle of via media, seeing itself as a central balance point between the extremes of the Reformation and the continuity of the Catholic Church, these things which were ripping apart Western Christendom. But the final settlement of the English state and of English religion came during the Elizabethan religious settlement, which followed on the back of a brief and bloody interruption by Bloody Mary, who was the last Catholic monarch who sought to unite the church back to Rome. During the Elizabethan reign, the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity were passed in 1559, and thus the protesting Catholic Church of England became a fossilised part of the state, and this settlement was policed both brutally and cunningly by a secret service that spied on the general population, ever vigilant for the influence of priestcraft. This new church was the creation of the state, and from that time onwards and into the present, it served primarily the nation's elites. And this is an interesting and important juxtaposition for you to note mentally. Alfred forged in England to serve the church. The Reformation forged a church to serve England, or more properly, the English elites. And the Church of England has been doing so ever since. Now, I've told you this story to try and help you to see why, to see that the church existed on these islands before anything that we can think of as being normative. Secondly, to make you realize that the church has changed its shape century upon century and has never been a static institution. It has always developed and changed according to the circumstances, the threats and the challenges. But also to frame for you the reason why the Church of England seems to be so slavish to the state and to the elites, even when they're not particularly Christian or pursuing a particular Christian agenda. Why the church seems to be led by the culture rather than leading the culture. Now, I want to fast forward our story a little bit and start getting to the main meat of our discourse, which is how liberalism begins to replace Christianity. The Enlightenment, a process that arguably we could say started in 1685 and arguably finished around 1815, is characterized by rationalism, empiricism, the pursuit of individual liberty, nationalism, patriotism, a devotional to technological innovation and progress, all which embody a common motif in which the understanding of the self turns to this world and turns to itself. The reorientation of culture toward, of epistemology towards empiricism and rationalism as an ordering doctrine in society, pushed by the self-evident power to effect change through increased mastery over nature, revolutionized the world primarily through the Industrial Revolution and the urbanization that followed and the slums that built up around it, and a resultant demystification of nature and of common life. The elites of England were captured by this new way of thinking that prized innovation over tradition, and they suitably organized all aspects of life around the state on the principles of rationality and reason. Old ways of life were therefore torn up, stripped away to forge new ones. Thinkers such as John Locke, Samuel Clarke, Matthew Tyndall placed reason and reason from nature as the theological basis for the development of the state's doctrines and values over and above the traditional reasoning from revelation and tradition. Thus, natural theology properly became the organizing authority for society and life. But natural theology only could give us a God that would seem more deist than theist. And this led increasingly to an Epicurean culture as it permeated outwards from the elites into the institutions and downwards across to everybody else. This saw the emergence and influence of deism, which, when mixed into the Christian matrix, became the very basis for the creation and the formation of the liberal societies that we see today. David Hempton, in his work The Church in the Long 18th Century, notes that the Church of England increasingly accommodated the Enlightenment rationalism in its thinking, but only up to the point where it didn't threaten established authority. In other words, to where it didn't threaten the elites. And that tells you a lot about the sentiments of the Church of England. There was nonetheless a reaction to this rise of a deistic culture, a response rooted in more traditional Christianity that emerged to engage polemically and apologetically with the deist heresy, such as Bishop Joseph and William Law, who attempted to counter the drift towards natural theology and reaffirm and re-establish the supremacy of revealed theology and traditional ways of thinking. However, it was a lost battle, and most began to think from within this new liberal matrix. It was quickly internalized, formalized, and propagated within the Church of England, and liberalism and the liberal sentiment remains an essential part of the Church of England today. Reactionary movements like the Tractarian movement that sought to re-establish the norms of agricultural society in the urban context only achieved the establishment of an Anglo-Catholicism within the Church of England, but didn't reverse the movement of modernity. Now, I tell you this because the core of our conversation, the subject that we will be discussing in the next 45 minutes, is going to be about liberalism and Christianity, about the differences between these two worldviews. And so I am going to present to you what I believe is an authentic, full-fat Christianity, and explain to you how liberalism took it over and sort of elicit some of the contrasts between the two. But before we get into the process of liberalization, I want to say that I'm splitting liberalism into two periods. The modern period between 1765 and 1960, and classical liberalism that went along with that, and progressive liberalism in the postmodern period that emerges from 1960 to the present. And I'll contrast each of these with how they replace Christianity or contest Christianity. But with the classical liberalism, I'll be giving it more as a bit more historical narrative rather than just ideas, as I will do when I go into progressive liberalism. So let's start off by thinking where Christianity begins. Christianity begins with your story, but authentic Christianity begins with your story within the church and frames your identity theologically as a militant of the new covenant community to which, as Christians, we belong. Classical liberalism, however, reframes your story within the story of the nation state that you belong to. Now, each of these kingdoms demands sacrifice. Each of these kingdoms demands fealty. And you see this in our culture in songs like I Vow to Thee, My Country, whose first stanzas talk about our patriotic loyalty to the nation state and then our spiritual loyalty to the kingdom of God. There is another kingdom, it states. Now, this results in no conflict if the nation state itself sees itself as a servant of the church, as a servant of Christ. A bit like how Alfred imagined England. But this becomes increasingly more problematic if the nation state, as has happened in the UK, de-Christianizes and sets goals and ambitions that are opposed to the good of the church and the good of the kingdom, which you see historically begins to happen increasingly from the Elizabethan period onwards. One of the earliest examples being the Crimean War. This can best be understood as which kingdom do you serve? the Christian must pursue the kingdom of God, which expresses itself in every area of life, including as political project. Liberalism, which went on to disciple the churches, encouraged churches to abandon the idea that Christianity should rule the state and to set the agenda, and that instead the state should pursue its agenda with the state as end, with the state as the end goal, apart from any sense of the kingdom of God, which was duly overly spiritualized by both liberals, deists, and some reformers who were influenced by liberalism and deism. Christendom became a forgotten idea amongst Christians. Now, bear with me one second. Yes. Now the church would accept that faith, the church came on to accept the new modernity, which was that faith was only a private matter and not a concern of the state. This resulted in religious tolerance, fashioned by the Whig Party, inspired by John Locke, through acts like the Toleration Act of 1689, the Test and Corporation Act of 1828, and the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. This granted equality under the law for religious minorities, but also it resulted in an uncoupling of the state having any concern for the kingdom of God as a matter of public policy. This laid the foundation of what has become our folks' multicultural society that was built from the 1950s onwards. Within modernity, the framework through which decisions would be made and the concerns of the state decided, both for state, culture, and individuals, were shifted from the process of reasoning from revelation, however that was understood, to reasoning from nature, and latterly just reasoning from the early proto-liberal values that emerged from that first exercise. The concern for freedom from religious interference by the state became an intrinsic part of the DNA of a liberal state, being paramount to the structures of modernity and the fashioning of that state. The power of the new sciences in mastering nature and the development of new technologies opened up new possibilities never before imagined. It had an enchanting effect on the elites, resulting in a concern to pursue innovation so that that innovation could be capitalized upon it, to improve life in society and to make money. Society was increasingly rationalized to the function of increasing and maximizing productivity in the service of the economy, which was the lifeblood and the power of the state. This dramatic shift away from the traditions and the rituals and the understanding of ontology that had been developed over thousands of years, over centuries of years of reflection on revelation, and which had been inculcated into agricultural life, was simply swept away. For the agricultural Christian would think of his life through the lenses of the final judgment and the hope of the resurrection, whereas in liberal modernity, they were encouraged to think about their own progress and success in this world as measured by financial gain or experience. Rationalization impacted all areas of life, including ethical and moral concerns. Life became about the pursuit of happiness, which replaced the pursuit of holiness. Utilitarian concerns became a new touchstone of morality and gave rise to a new ethic of humanity, which replaced the concern for a virtuous life as directed towards God as end. Human rights replaced in our moral thinking the idea of the just society as framed within Christian moral systems. This emerged out of a shared doctrine that the early liberals shared with their Christian inheritance, the doctrine of the Imago Dei, a common doctrine a common doctrine that was shared by both deists, liberals of every stripe, and Christians of every stripe. The Christian faith was in this way forced into a private and individual enterprise, ever subservient to the needs and never challenging the godlike primacy of the state. This position was accepted by many Christians who molded new forms of the Christian life to this reality. Groups like the Methodist movement, the Evangelicals, and latterly Pentecostals arose in part as a reaction to this modernity and partly as a syncretic adoption of it, with the accommodation to a personal and private faith, personal piety, while still asserting afresh scriptural authority. The individual person would go and undergo individual conversion and follow revelation from an individual matrix. The self was framed as Christian, but that Christian accepted the normativity of a liberal, secular, humanist state. The church adopted the role of keeper of civic ritual, charity, and occasionally, as shown by William Wilberforce, the conscience of the nation. Now, if the Reformation wars were the trauma that gave rise to the Enlightenment and its liberalism, the modern world wars, back to back, is the trauma that gave rise to the shift from modernity to post-modernity, from classical liberalism to progressive liberalism. Progressive liberalism stripped away any need of a greater meta-narrative and dropped the idea of a national identity. Now your life was to be entirely framed as your own existential journey of self-discovery, an individual apart from all else, which again stands in contrast to the Christian communal identity as the body of Christ of a nation of priests to the new covenant. Though one can see how from Christian beliefs and practices like baptism, confession, and vocation, the sense of the individual existential journey is actually present nascently within the Christian faith, in progressive liberalism, this has taken to new extremes. This stripping away down to the individual gives a space in a postmodern culture for the church to re-emerge in fresh ways. There is an opportunity here for us if we will grasp it by throwing out again this our own individual journey as Christians, as part of the new covenant people, as part of God's holy church, his royal priesthood, his nation set apart unto himself. Whereas life is framed in personal exploration, in progressive thought, of people discovering who they are. One thinks of the proverbial child who has discovered that they are in fact a cat born in the wrong body. Within the Christian faith, one discovers who God calls them to be through particular but not unique vocations. For the service of the kingdom of God, a priest, an evangelist, an industrialist, a father, a mother, and so on. Within post-modernity, progressive liberalism has led to the collapse in culture of hard scientific facts. Empiricism and science and rationalism have given way. Gender now is said to be a construct rather than something intrinsically tied to chromosomes. Men are said to be able to menstruate and to breastfeed. Hard science has given way to hard feelings. And there is a subjectivity to the truth within a liberal progressive culture in which all are said to have their own truth, both to be discovered and shared with the other. And all cultures are deemed relative and equally valid, even if those cultures marry children, practice slavery, or practice female genital mutilation. Christianity, by contrast, holds that personal truths are framed and prismed through the life of Jesus Christ, who himself is the embodiment of all truth, the measure of all truth, who has formed the universe to contain truth. And as such, it holds within itself indisputable facts that are there to be discovered, but cannot be dismissed once found. And that there are moral values that cannot be challenged. Therefore, all cultures are not equal, and not everything that you feel is true. Human rights are being organized in liberal progressive society in terms of a matrix that prioritizes victimhood, in which some groups receive special preferences in law and culture above that what is called the majority group or the oppressing group. By contrast, the Imago Dei commits the Christian to the idea that under Christian law, all people will be treated equally. Christians maintain that the point of life is not to construct the laws of the land to allow for personal fulfillment, however subjectively defined, but rather to cultivate virtue in the life of the subjects and point those subjects towards God as end in the service of his kingdom. Now that I've kind of framed the context of our conversation, I'm going to offer to you what I think we as Christians can do in response to where we find ourselves today. After I've done that, I'm going to invite you all to take great use of the fact that you've got a wonderful selection of teas and cakes and coffees, and make yourself orders and clear up any bills that you might owe for sitting in the talk, and then use the facilities, and we'll reconvene 10 minutes once the break begins. But now I'm going to present to you what I think we as Christians in the 21st century must do in response to this liberal takeover, to this liberalization. So what then can the church do in the 21st century in the wake of these realities? How can we respond to the replacement of our Christian heritage, culture and lifestyle that's occurred over the last 2.5 centuries? I would put it to you, brethren, that we have to begin by recapturing our identity as fully as possible as Christians in an unadulterated way. We must reject the premise that is there in the song, I vow to thee, my country, and replace it solely with, I vow to thee, my God. It must be an unsullied identity as Christians, to see ourselves as the priests of God, as brethren to one another and to no one else, in a new nation, in a new people whose only defining feature is our common allegiance to the new covenant. We must then begin to construct from this identity both a culture and a political agenda from which a new society, a new Christian society, can emerge. We can do this best by looking critically into the history of the church and bringing forward aspects of that past, where necessary with revisions, and where necessary just as is found, into the present, and form new practices of the faith where necessary in the modern context. These should be based squarely on Christian doctrine in an unadulterated and unadapted way, and on Christian values in an unadulterated, unadapted way. So the only thing that changes is how we implement the doctrine and the values. We don't try to change the doctrines and the values, which has been the mistake of liberal Christians consistently for centuries. We should express our life as Christians as a distinct people, emphasizing that which makes us different to others, not what makes us similar to others. And we must do so with confidence and zeal, and we must do so through a culture that we form and create. We should defend our rights to be Christian fearlessly and with zeal, and we must lose any fear of confrontation and conflict. As part of this, we should actively pursue a new Christendom as a civilizational project, inspired by King Alfred the Great, and cultivate virtue ethics as part of that discipleship. We must, in short, be committed to the triumph of the Christian Church over all other contenders, and not seek accommodation. Once again, learning how to build Christian families from first encounter to the birth of the first great-grandchild. This absolutely needs to be an essential part of this new Christian culture, the importance of the family. Christians should always prioritize solidarity with other Christians above all else, and in the face of all of her enemies, and the church does have enemies. The importance of bringing family into the center of this new Christian culture is because it is in families that cultures are passed down. So if you build strong families, you build the vehicle by which your culture is passed on and passed forward. We should accept that we live in a post-Christian UK and stop harping on about how the UK is meant to be Christian. It's Christian on paper only. But we must use the latent Christian sentiment as much as we can to draw people into this new civilizational project. We need to consolidate our communities, our resources, our people, and our energies into smaller geographical spaces, literally take over constituencies, target them. Now, I'm not a fantasist. I don't think that Roman Catholics and Calvinists are going to be able to live in the same constituency and make this idea work. So I'm suggesting that the Calvinists do it in one constituency, the Catholics do it in another constituency, the Baptists in another, the Pentecostals in another, and may the best church win. Now, once we've consolidated, we will then be in the best position to start building outwards. If you don't believe me, look at where these consolidated communities are already in practice and the impact of them. The Muslim community uses consolidated communities. Is anyone in any doubt that they're impacting our society? Look at Northern Ireland. You have two political communities that have consolidated, and they've managed to sustain, sadly, a conflict well past the point that everyone else got over the conflict in Northern Ireland. Look at the Jewish community and how it sustains itself in Golders Green. Consolidated communities work for whoever uses them, and if they work for everyone else, they can work for Christians. Discipleship needs to include not just knowledge of Christian doctrine, but also of Christian history, Christian culture, Christian cultural practices, Christian ritual, Christian ethics, Christian values, and a cultivation of a Christian political agenda. And a sense of a new identity of the people of God, the covenant people of God, on mission to transform, change, and to capture this nation again for Christ. And it begins with the deliberate capturing of institutions. And those of us that agree with this project, those of us that have not succumbed to liberalism, should deliberately go out of our way by capturing church institutions to begin with, like the Church of England, by deliberately targeting things like the HR and the seminaries, and once we've captured them, to backfill them with other people that agree with us, so that and using our newfound positions to filter out progressives and classical liberals, whilst bringing in more conservatively minded Christians and Orthodox Christians, to recapture those churches as the beginning point by which we begin to recapture the nation. Thank you very much. Please enjoy your 10-minute break. I finished 1 minute early, so we've got 11 minutes. Grab yourself a drink, use the loo, pay your bills, and yes. Right, folks. I hope that you're all enjoying it. I don't think I've scared everybody off. So this next 45 minutes is essentially about us having a conversation together. The main thrust of it is, you know, like what I'm going to invite you to do is to ask questions or make comments. But what I would ask you to do is not to give speeches, because I want to allow as many people to ask or to comment as possible. So I am going to sort of informally time you and limit you if you want to make a point rather than ask a question. I'm going to limit you to maybe 3 minutes, depending on whether I think it's a really good point or not. Right? Sorry. And the point now is for us to have a free-flowing conversation. But the question that I would sort of put to you to kick that off is how as Christians do we respond to the liberalisation of the church? Or should we respond at all? Is actually liberalism and the liberalisation of the church something that we should celebrate and not try to reverse or change? So I'm going to throw that thought out there, and if you could just raise your hand and I'll pick it and just govern it as we go. Go on, brother.
Yeah, it was just something you said earlier. I can't remember exactly what it was you said, but it was something along the lines of we shouldn't bend values. We have to bend our values to suit Christianity rather than the other way around.
Yes.
Myself personally, I'm born a Christian, nominally a Christian, but I go to church every now and then, but I'm not really a true Christian in the traditional sense of the word.
Yeah.
But I just want to know what you meant by that, because for me it seems very difficult to not adapt the religion to suit the times.
Yeah.
Because everything changes, everything moves on, values, principles and ethics change almost on a yearly basis now.
Yep.
So, you know, how does that manifest itself in practical terms?
So let me give you an example. One of the values that changed within the Christian faith at the birth of the Enlightenment was one of the values that changed was this idea that the state should serve the church. That the church was, as it were, more important than the state. And the church leads and the state follows. Right? Now that was a given at the time of Alfred the Great, and it was a given before Henry VIII. Though it wasn't always practiced. They were obviously bad kings. What changed at the Enlightenment was this idea that now the state should lead and the church follows. So it's a reversal of the role. Now, what I'm suggesting is that as Christians, we need to rediscover pre-Enlightenment Christian values and bring them in the 21st century without any dilution, without any adaptation to modernity, but only adapt in praxis. So what do I mean by adapting in praxis? Well, obviously, we don't live in a time of kings and knights, and we don't settle our differences anymore by meeting on a field and chopping one another to pieces with swords. We sort out our differences through a democratic process. So we would then create Christian political institutions and Christian political parties to the aim of giving voice to that value. Another way that you could think about it is that in the Enlightenment, particularly in progressive liberalism, the emphasis is all about the individual story. It's a hyper-individualism. It's your story, apart from anything else, right? And you discover your story as you go through life. Well, a Christian counter to that is that as Christians, we don't have a story that is separated from other Christians. We have a collective story in which we live out a particular story. So we pursue a particular vocation, but that vocation is directed to the good of the whole, the people of God. And so these would be ways that we would bring that value straight into the world, and thus we would reject this idea of individualism for a more collectivism within the church. Does that make sense?
It does at kind of a group level, but I was kind of more meaning kind of like an individual level.
Well, what I'm trying to...
For example, could I just give you one example? So just using the kind of traditional Christian insistence that no sex before marriage.
Yeah.
And while that's a desirable ambition to have, is it a reality in today's modern society, given that, because obviously when the Bible was written, society was quite different.
I get the point.
Yeah.
So
what's your stance on that? Things like that, for example.
So to answer that question, I mean, the evidence would suggest that, is it realistic that Christians can be celibate before marriage? No. Like, the evidence would seem to suggest that Christians are having lots of hanky-panky before marriage, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean that we should give up the standard. Doesn't mean that we give up the belief or the value. What it means is we need to think differently about organising our communities and how we organise church life. Because one of the reasons why that standard has failed is because the church has adopted the romantic model from Hollywood. This idea that you're meant to fatalistically meet someone across a vape-filled room, your eyes meet, you fall in love over a glass of apple juice, and then you get married a year or two later having romanced one another. That's just the world's way of doing it with some Christian sprinkles. What we actually need to do is get back to the idea of arranged marriages within the Christian community, deliberately seeking to introduce single Christians to one another in a culture that is pro-marriage, in which there is no pressure to go to any kind of social setting to find your partner, because if you just hang around in the church settings, the culture itself will introduce you to people. And so we don't need to change the values. What we need to do is we need to change how we're trying to live those values out. Go on.
Just going to say, I grew up in Cornwall, and there was nearly always a lot more women than men. So that wouldn't have worked. So you would have to look outside of your church surroundings to find a man.
Yeah.
I never did.
Yeah.
I never found one. And I said there was only a few eligible men, and a lot of women. So I attended a fellowship group. It was nearly all women as well. So there is an issue there.
Yes.
It's not that simple.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the problem that you're describing is a deficiency of masculinity within the church. I don't think it's because there's a deficiency of men in Cornwall, but rather there's a deficiency of men in the church, and that's because a lot of our churches have followed a very emasculated spirituality and a very emasculated religious practice. But also it's because we're too divided and we're too spread out. If all the Christians of Cornwall had gone, right, we're all moving in together there, then your chances of finding a partner would have increased dramatically. If those same churches had sort of embodied and expressed a more masculine, a more muscular Christianity, then it would have attracted more men. And I know that's a fact because I'm an evangelist that does a lot of work. Many of you have come because you already know of my evangelism. And if you look across this room, it's nearly a 50-50 split. Slightly more men than women. Which just goes to prove that if you push out a masculine energy, the men come in. And that's the missing demographic in the church. So I already know how you reach men. And it isn't by doing a wishy-washy kind of soy spirituality. Would you like to come back on that?
No.
Okay. Any other questions or points or comments? And it is a first come, first serve. Don't matter if you've already spoke once. So you can speak again.
I was just a bit confused by some terminology that you used
Yep.
in the talk, Bob.
Go on.
So can you just explain what you mean by deism and theism?
Yeah. So deism is a view of, like an Epicurean God. It's a God that's built. I'm going to come to that. He builds a clock, he winds it up, and then he goes off and does something else, and he leaves the clock running. That's like a deist God. And I combine that with Epicureanism because the Epicureans, who were an ancient Greek movement, had the view of the gods that they weren't interested in the world. The gods had just gone off and done something else, and now the world was just left to itself. And so they were concerned with having lots of parties in gardens and avoiding any kind of suffering. And doesn't that sound like our culture? That's all about entertainment and pleasure and avoiding suffering. So we have an Epicurean culture because deism was the principal influence behind liberal society. It was the principal theological impulse. God is not concerned with the world except as a creator, and he leaves us to get on and do it ourselves. Would you like to come back on that?
And what about theism?
So theism is this idea that God doesn't just create the world, but he interacts with the world. He talks to people. He comes down and visits. He actually does stuff. He meddles. That's a more theistic God.
So which point of view are you coming at it from? Theism?
All Christians are theists.
Theists.
Yeah. Yeah, go on.
So my question is around elitism and the establishment. So in regards to how your view of that is, what do you think their motives are? Because clearly people that have the more power and influence, they're allowing certain things to happen, they're making things permissible, plus pushing certain narratives and allowing certain things to happen in the West particularly, which we can see in Europe and America here. So what do you believe are their motives, and if there's any spiritual ground to that, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that as well. And how can they be stopped, essentially, because clearly they're having a massive impact?
Well, I mean, we'll talk about the elites of Western society, and then we'll talk about the elites of the church, but I'll actually start with the elites of the church. The motive of many of the elites of the church, i.e. our church leaders, is that their comfortable lives are not interrupted by suffering or conflict. That they continue to get invited to the best parties, that they continue to get invited to the best dinner parties, and particularly the elites of the Church of England, their motive is to serve the other elites of England. Which is why the Archbishop of Canterbury seems to just be an echo of whatever the liberal establishment says, and he goes along and backs up whatever policies the liberal establishment government wants to push out. In my own personal interpretation of British elites is that they're an internationalized community that see themselves as part of an internationalized village, and they have molded the state along internationalized lines. And I think that's their driving narrative. It's devoid of God, and it's more functionary, but towards an idea of internationalism, which I think is their key narrative. Now, to respond to that, we've got to first recognise that the church is internationalist. The church is Catholic. It's a universal church. A Christian will recognise a Christian from any other part of the country. We move amongst one another as Christians internationally, and always have done for 2,000 years. But the Christian concept of nationhood is more integralist. It's more about keeping power as close to the people that are ruled by that power as possible. And that pushes the state in a different direction from the kind of openness of the internationalist elites. It pushes it more about like focusing in not on necessarily global problems first, but national problems first and local community problems before that. And I think that as Christians, one of the ways that we deal with this is we've got to rediscover a Christian political narrative so that we're not borrowing from the left or the right of politics. Do you want to come back on that?
No, that's a really good point. In terms of, so I can see the grassroots, like that swelling going upwards. Is there a way to affect people at the top as well? Because if people like archbishops are even catering to this, then like that's not a good sign. Yeah, is there ways we can positively influence those people?
Okay.
So it's like a
you've got to deliberately go out of your way to capture the institutions. So in terms of the church, that means we've got to deliberately, those of us that want to reclaim the West for Christendom, reclaim the West for Christ, we've got to deliberately target with a kind of missionary zeal, with a missionary sense of purpose. We've got to capture HR. We've got to capture the seminaries. And when we've captured those key points, we start filtering out the progressives. We start cutting off the progressives as they try to get in, or the liberals as they try to get in. And we let in people who are more leaning or sympathetic to our perspective, or who hold our perspective. And if we do that generationally, and it is a generational project, if we do that generationally, that's how we'll begin to replace the elites. You know?
HR standing for?
Human resources.
I thought so, I was just checking.
Yeah. Go on, bro.
Yes,
and then you. Go on.
Following on from what you said, when you filtering out the progressives, what does that mean exactly? What do those progressive people believe or practice that you think you should
filter out? Yeah. So I'll give some totems of what progressive ideology is about. Like, now, this isn't a full description of progressive, but it comes on some of it'll touch on some of the points of conflict between Christians and progressives in terms of our engagement. A progressive will be pro-abortion. A progressive will be in favour of a laissez-faire attitude towards family construction, the definition of the family, the idea of marriage not being particularly important, or the family not being particularly important. The progressive will believe in intersectionality, this idea that there are oppressors and oppressed, and that, you know, they'll believe that the white Christian male has oppressed everyone else, and therefore we need to correct those historical imbalances through proactive use of law. So, and Christians would be against those things. So when we
You're not talking about progressive Christians, then, just talking about progressive.
Well, progressive Christians pretty much go along with just progressive culture.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah, very much so. Like they don't question the culture. You know, if a progressive Christian today had been born in 1930s Germany, they would have been saying Sieg Heil. They would have just gone along with Hitler. The progressives just go along with whatever the culture tells them, because they identify with their culture. They don't critique their culture from Christian revelation. So what I meant by keeping them out, what I mean is if we are in control of HR or the seminaries, and we identify someone who has progressive values, we simply deny their application. And I won't suffer any lectures about, oh, this is discrimination based upon belief, because Christians are constantly being discriminated against because of our beliefs by progressives. Do you want to come back on that, bro?
No.
Okay. You, I think.
Yes.
And then you.
I was going to make a point about education, and that ties into what you were saying around generational change.
Yep.
So, something I've been thinking about recently is our children really seem to be captured by this liberalism that's taught as like a gospel to childhood. And I think I'd be interested to hear your thoughts around what we can do practically. I was thinking that might look like community schools within like church community schools, things like that, in a way to fight that and actually educate with maybe English history or with Christian history.
Okay.
But
I think in terms of it is a very true point that whoever controls the schools largely gets to form the next generation. And right now, to all Christians in the room and who watch this later, I'll just say state education is not a safe place for Christian children. It has been captured by militant progressives who want to push militant progressive ideas onto our children. I would encourage you, if you can, to do homeschooling. If you can't, then try to find a Christian school, and even possibly, if you can, move to it. All of the problems that we're going to talk about over the next series of 4 talks, you're going to hear this theme come from me again and again and again, which is that the Christian community needs to consolidate. You can't run effective community schools unless there is a density of Christian population. Right now, Christians are spread thin all over the country. We can't sustain even the church institutions. We're losing even the church institutions because we can't man them with enough Christians. So what we need to do is to consolidate so that the institutions that we build have that density of population. Does that make sense? Would you like to come back on that?
No, I think I agree.
Yeah. I would just add to that, and then when we do that, we can actually be in control of what's taught in our schools. Because if the school can only recruit from the local population, and the local population is us, and the school governing boards is recruited from the local population that's us, and our children are the ones that fill the school, who do you think's going to get a say on what that school teaches the kids?
Can I actually ask another question? Do you mind? On the same topic.
Well, I gave you a chance to come back. You wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, so
You can jump in next time. Go on.
well, my question is actually for a few, based on a few gentlemen's question ago.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, I don't know if this works, but I wanted to ask how, just out of curiosity, how has the Church of England historically navigated the tensions between the liberalism and, especially particularly in like the 19th and the 20th centuries?
So you have movements like, I would say that on the whole, the Church of England has just gone along with liberalisation. But the thing that you've got to bear in mind is that to our progressive liberal culture today, the classical liberal looks almost alt-right. If you brought George Washington and Wellington and Napoleon into today's world, they would more align with Tommy Robinson than they would with the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. And so there's been a shift in what liberalism is, but the church has always just followed liberalism. If you go into lots of Anglican churches, they have the flags of regiments. So they celebrated the empire. St. Paul's Cathedral was the cathedral of empire. So the Church of England just always went along with the culture, didn't really do much. There were counter movements, like there were the Oxford movement, which was a movement of social reform from an evangelical perspective. There were the Tractarians, which was an attempt to re-establish the norms of pre-modern England in the industrial setting. The church, when it recognised in about 1851 that only 50% of the population was going to church, went upon this massive church building programme and built churches across England. So all across London you're going to see churches from around the 1850s onwards. But the church from Elizabethan times was always a servant to the state. And so it always went along with what the English elites wanted. And now that those English elites aren't even Christian, the Church of England is still going along with what they want. So the truth is the Church of England has been a very poor defender of Christian orthodoxy, though there have always been Orthodox movements operating within the Church of England. That's why a lot of churches broke away from the Church of England and you had the birth of so many non-conformist churches. But the problem of secularization occurs because you plant a church, you break away from this liberalized church, you plant an Orthodox church full of committed Christians. And then over the next 100 years, those committed Christians move away or die. But you haven't successfully passed on your faith to the next generation, and those that have maybe move away. that church then has a choice. It either closes down or it lowers its standards to bring people in. And invariably what has happened in institution after institution after institution, including in churches, is that because they can't fill their roles, their offices, with Christians, they have let in non-Christians, and by doing that they've diluted their Christian identity until literally entire churches have stopped being Christian, like the Quaker movement and like the Church of England is today. Do you want to come back on that, sister?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Do you
think that the process of secularization would be, would the church be strengthened or weakened by disestablishment?
I think that the Church of England would be helped by de-establishment because it would take away some of the gloss that the Church of England currently varnishes itself in. And without that gloss, I think a lot of people who kind of attach themselves to the Church of England would just move away because it doesn't have that, oh, I get to meet the King, or I get special privileges as Church of England vicar. I think de-establishment is for the best of the Church of England. But let's remember, as the talk tried to show, the Church of England is not the same as the Church in England. The Church in England is bigger than the Church of England. And so the de-establishment of the Church of England would put the Church of England on the same footing as all the other churches that currently exist in England. And I would argue that plenty of those churches are doing better than the Church of England. And they're surviving quite well outside of establishment. Would you like to come back on that?
So do you mean that de-establishment would give the church more freedom in a sense?
Yes, because it would mean that the Church of England doesn't automatically see itself as the servant of the English elites or the elites of the British state. Brother, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, so you said like the Reformation moulded the church for the elite and the state. So first, would you say there's like a disconnect between the Church of England specifically and churches in general with the working class in this country?
Well, funnily enough, yeah. Like one of the reasons, in the 1800s, one of the reasons for the birth of nonconformist churches, not just because a lot of nonconformist churches wanted a fuller Reformation, but it was also because a lot of they were born and grew particularly amongst working classes, because those same working classes who were living in in the shadow of Blake's dark satanic mills and in the slums saw the church as being on the side of the elites that were leaving them in abject poverty. And so you've seen the nonconformist Christian churches are the churches that grow best amongst the working classes. They were organized on a flatter structure. And they led to things like the Welsh revivals and many of the revivals that occurred in the UK in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The Church of England, only because of its huge resources, is one of the few churches today that can maintain a presence in the poorest areas. But unfortunately, it does so very ineffectively, precisely because it isn't missionizing and evangelizing those working classes towards anything Christian. It's simply treating itself as either a charity, an NGO to that community, or a keeper of civic rituals, or in more middle class areas, it tries to present itself as a bit of a social club. Come to church, make friends, build a network. And this is all because of a deficiency in our understanding of what it is to be church, what it is to be Christian, and what it is to be the Christian church. Which is why I'm trying to say that we need to rediscover this sense that we are the people of God who are united not by any other feature but by the fact of our allegiance to the new covenant established by our Lord Jesus Christ. And in that identity begin to reform an agenda and not create necessarily new institutions, but perhaps try and capture the ones that already exist. Do you want to come back on that?
Yeah. So, in like a historic sense, could you say that the Reformation moulding the church and the elite for the state has trickled down into having a mainly middle-class leadership?
Into the middle-class leadership of the church.
Of the church, yeah.
Yes, I would say that. I would say that on the whole, my sort of one-line summary of current church leadership is it's comfortable Christians trying to live comfortable lives. But the call of the way of the cross, the call of Christ, is that we carry our cross. You know, the Christ is a way of suffering. It's a symbol of death. You know, when Jesus said, carry your cross, it would be like me saying to you, carry your gas chamber, carry your lethal injection, carry your hangman's noose. Like, that image is what, when Jesus said, carry your cross every day, it had that sense about it. And what we've replaced that with is wrap yourself in a comfy blanket because God loves you. And that's not a kingdom mentality. That is not a disciple of Christ's mentality. We're meant to be more than conquerors. We're meant to be fearless. We're meant to be people who take ground for the kingdom and transform this world around us so that it aligns itself to the will of our God, that his kingdom is on earth as it is in heaven. Any other questions? Go on.
On that kind of theme, how do we, if it's possible, do a good branding sales job to people who are non-Christians and bring them on that journey with us? A lot of people who aren't Christians are on certain birthdays and things. Like, this is a Christian nation. A lot of them aren't even Christians.
Yeah.
They clearly value what Christ stands for and what has happened here.
Yeah.
So how do we bring them along without ostracizing people, whether they are atheistic or Muslim or whatever?
Yep.
So how do we do that, as in take them along the journey with them and warmly embrace them with that?
Yeah, I get the question. So firstly, I would just say, why are you worried about ostracizing people? No, let me finish my point. It should not be our concern to worry about whether people are ostracized by the gospel. To those that are being saved, the gospel smells like the sweet aroma of life. To those that are on the path of destruction, the gospel stinks like death. Right? Jesus ostracized lots of people. Why are we worried about offending people? Why are we worried about upsetting people? Right? As Christians, the way that we live our life is obviously to be loving, but loving doesn't mean denying who you are. And if you are truly living the Christian life, unfortunately, because the church really does have enemies, you are going to offend people. That can't be avoided, and we shouldn't try to avoid it. So long as they're being offended by us living authentic Christian lives, rather than being offended by something else. Yeah? Now, in terms of carrying with us the patriotic movement, because you mentioned them, well, it's about having as clearer and as deep an understanding of what it means to be Christian as possible, and to live that out as a culture, unashamed, together. And if we live it out as a culture, as a strong and deep identity, you'll find that lots of people will want to come with us. Because right now, England is aching for a sense of its own identity. And there is no English identity, as you saw in the history, that isn't Christian. England was born of the fight to build a Christian kingdom and to resist a pagan invasion. Sound familiar? I want to give Harry, who is our host, an opportunity to ask questions. He said he had lots of questions, and
I had one.
Go on.
It was in reference to masculinity, which you kind of spoke on. And you said that we are to sort of deny ourselves, I vow to thee, my country.
Yeah.
But that's such a masculine trope.
Yes.
How do you put those two together?
Well, I would say in Hebrews 11, I think it's Hebrews 11, it says that those that have a country of their own don't seek another country. But it says that we are a people who are seeking another homeland because we have left the homeland that we came from. Like Abraham, like Israel coming out of Egypt. So the people of God have left this world behind, and we are pursuing the kingdom. That is our homeland. So this kind of syncretism that occurred in early liberal modernity, in which we created this sense of a dual nationality. I am a Kingdom of God citizen and I am a British citizen. I am patriotic to the King of England and I am a faithful follower of the King of Kings, Jesus Christ. That is a compromised syncretic belief. It's just like Christians in Africa or India who mix witchcraft or Hindu worship with Christianity. We've done the same. It's just that we can't see it. We can see it when we go abroad, but we can't see it because we were born here. Forget the I vow to thee my country. Our only vow is to Christ as King and to his kingdom and to drawing that kingdom down here in the United Kingdom by offering our lives as living sacrifice. And when we start talking about that kind of masculine spirituality, of encouraging men to stand up against the enemies of the church, and of pushing all obstacles to the kingdom aside to bring about the kingdom here on earth, what you will find is that will draw men in. Because that is a masculine spirituality. It speaks to all the dynamics of a man's mind. There's teams, there's a them and us, there's a competition, and there's a fight. That's why men pack stadiums in their tens of thousands, but you can't find them in church. Because in church, what messages do they get? Love everybody, be nice, be kind, don't be confrontational, don't be so conflictual, don't be so aggressive. That does not speak to men. Now, obviously, we have to frame all of this narrative and make sure that it doesn't lead to avenues of hatred, resentment, bitterness, or malice, or vengeance, because those are vices. But a Christian can fight ferociously for the kingdom of God from a place of love, hope, and faith. Does that make sense? Do you want to come back?
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking about St. George.
Yes.
And the knights, that epitomised a national Christianity, and we did use that. We could use that in the fights, in the masculine fights that we've had.
Yeah.
You're saying we should deny that, or?
I would say that when you actually look into the chivalric orders, so for example, the Knights of St. John Hospitaller, which is an order that still exists. There are still knights today of the Knights of St. John Hospitaller. We set up in the Crusades in the 11th century. Jealous of my own preferred order, which is the Knights Templar. They decided that the Templars were having too much fun and they were going to get in on the act. They weren't just going to run hospitals. They were going to get involved in fighting as well. The Knights St. John Hospitaller would have chapters based upon different countries. For obvious reasons, those reasons being linguistic. So you'd have a French chapter, you'd have an Italian chapter, you'd have an English chapter. And the reason why they were organised by national chapters was just because, your average English person couldn't understand your average Italian person and vice versa. But the Knights of St. John Hospitaller was an international order. It covered the whole of Christendom. It was everywhere. And so the chivalric code, which emerged in France in a chaotic period in France, in which the chevaliers, the knights, were going around raping and pillaging and stealing and robbing from women and peasants and poor and orphans, the church tried to get on top of that problem by creating a martial code that we now call the chivalric code or chivalry. And what it sought to do is to turn a warrior class into gentlemen. And that's where the term gentleman comes from. And how does a gentleman show that he's a gentleman? He shows deference to the weak, which, whether you think it's sexist or not, at the time was considered women. And so a chivalrous man would do chivalrous things like opening a door for a lady because she couldn't possibly strain herself to open it on her own with her own muscles. But that same chivalric order and understanding needs to now go the other way. We need to turn what are a lot of very gentle men in the church into more warriors. And that chivalric code is a bridge by which we do that. But the thing is, intrinsic to the chivalric orders was an internationalism of a sense of fighting for the church, because they were all born in the crusading period. And in the crusading period, my own particular hero, for instance, Louis IX, sacrificed the wealth and the entirety of his kingdom to defend Christians on the other side of the world. That's what chivalry and knightly orders look like. That's what a kind of nationalist Christianity is involved in. Any other questions? Go on.
I can't say it so eloquently as you, but you mentioned earlier on that if some people came back from the past, that they'd be more in line with Tommy Robinson.
Yeah, George Washington, Wellington, all of that lot. Yeah.
So I just wondered if you could elaborate on that, explain it a bit further. Please.
Okay, well, Tommy Robinson is often villainized as alt-right in our culture, right? But anyone who has listened to his speeches and knows what he talks about, he is literally just a civic nationalist. Now, civic nationalism was born and is a direct fruit of classical liberalism. George Washington, Napoleon, Wellington, all of our, in quote marks, national heroes were all classical liberals. They were all patriotic civic nationalists. And that's all Tommy Robinson is. So if you brought all of these heroes in today and you sat them in a room with a bunch of progressives, to the progressives, they would all sound like Tommy Robinson. That's what I was trying to communicate. As time has gone on, because of the trauma of the 2 world wars, that civic nationalism has been replaced by a hyper-individualism. So Christianity frames your individual story within the context of the church as understood within the New Covenant. In classical liberalism, your individual story becomes contextualized and framed within the national story, and you are either a militant for the state directly or you serve in the economy which feeds the state as an individual. In progressive liberalism, what occurs is it's not about you having a connection to any sense of a bigger story. Your story, your individual story is the only thing that matters. And there is no bigger story. It's just you. It's called the petit narrative. So those are the... And what I'm saying is we need to rediscover that Christian understanding of our story. Do you want to come back on that?
No, thank you for explaining.
Okay, any other questions? Probably could do one more. First come, first serve. Go on.
Yeah, well, could I say about the Church of England? Because I know Holy Trinity Brompton, where I used to go, they're setting up the Peter Stream.
Yep.
Where they're encouraging the church to use people like Peter, who was just an ordinary fisherman. Jesus chose ordinary people. And it seems to be really encouraging. The Church of England is actually saying, no, we've got to change sort of university degrees and everything. They're now focusing on ordinary people who are committed Christians. It's called the Peter Stream, and it's taking off.
And this is the point, is that there are renewal movements like that. You know, there's renewal movements within the Church of England emanating from St. Helens. There's renewal movements emanating from, Holy Trinity Brompton. I wish my own Anglo-Catholic party would be a bit more on it. You know, unfortunately, the mentality of the average Anglo-Catholic is one of survival. Please don't bully me. You know, we just hide away and hope that nobody notices us because we're scared of being kicked out. We're not ready to join Rome. But the point is, the liberal churches die, right? But the point about liberals who are entering the church is they're not interested in pushing their liberalism through winning the conversation. They enter the church and they go straight for the seats of power, and once they've got in power, they kick everybody else out that they don't like. If you look at all the liberal bishops and their careers, I don't think any of them have led a successful church. Every church that they touch dies. And the Church of England is dying on its feet because of the apostasy of liberal bishops and liberal clergy. But these renewal movements, the only reason why the Church of England doesn't get rid of St. Helens and Holy Trinity Bompton is because those are the cash cows of the Church of England. And the Church of England, and those, I encourage those churches to cut off the liberal bishops. Don't fund them. Let them starve. And to build from within these new networks. So I fully applaud that St. Peter stream. Do you want to come back on that?
Thanks so much.
Any other questions? We could probably take one more. First come first. Wait, did someone else have their hand up at the same time on this side?
I did.
Then ladies first. She did have her hand up before you. Go on.
I was just going to ask, how do you envisage being able to revitalise and build the Christian community when the state seems so very much set against that?
Brilliant. We can have martyrs and confessors, and we can suffer for Jesus. That is how we do it. So the way that we do it is one, we've got to consolidate. I can't stress this enough. We need, as a Christian people, to consolidate our resources, our energies, our institutions, our infrastructure, our manpower needs to be consolidated. But also, we need to elevate this idea of being distinct and different to everyone around us. We need to emphasize what makes us different to everybody else, not what makes us the same as everybody else. When we do that, we're going to rub up against people. There is going to be conflict, including with the state. That's why we need to elevate the cult of martyrdom and celebrate when people are suffering for Jesus and rally behind those people that are suffering for Jesus. Right? There used to be a time, if you think about the Christian movement, all of our greatest heroes in their own time and place were seen as the bad guys. They were seen as the criminals. They were seen as the naughty people. When, as a Christian movement, did we suddenly become this, we can't say boo to a ghost because we might offend somebody group? We need to lose that mindset and get back to, I don't mind dying for Jesus so long as you're killing me for Jesus' sake. We need to get back to celebrating when a Christian is being prosecuted and being villainized in the media, and we need to rally around that person and call them hero when all the media is calling them a villain because they decided not to go along with, say, the selling of children to gay couples through what's the term called? You know, when someone rents out a womb, and surrogacy. Yeah, we need to get back to celebrating the Christian villains of culture, and we need more villains. We need more people who are willing to be different. Yeah. And on that happy note, we're going to bring this to a we're going to bring this to a timely end because we're going to bring this to a timely end. It is now 8:45, and I promised that we would be finished timely. So thank you very much. I hope you've had something good from it. Can I just ask, if you enjoyed this talk, if you thought it was worth coming to, then please bring someone to the next one, which is about the church and Islam. And if you thought this was explosive, wait until I talk about that one.